Welcome to the Urban Agenda, a production of the Community Service Society of New York. I'm David R. Jones, president of the organization and your host today. Today's show will examine what's happened to Dr. Martin Luther King's dream for America. Have we lost the war for civil rights? Here to help me answer these questions is distinguished law professor and best-selling author Derrick Bell. Dismissed from his post as a Harvard law professor because he protested the lack of any tenured African-American women professors, he is now a visiting professor at NYU Law School. Bell writes about his experiences of racism in his latest book, Confronting Authority, Reflections of an Ardent Protester.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Professor Bell, it's really wonderful to have you here today.
That question, it's the theme of your show, causes me to think the reality is no one is even asking the question, much less trying to answer it, what happened to Martin Luther King's dream. And that's probably a pretty sad but accurate way of summarizing where we've gone in the last 20 years.
Well, what is your gut sense? What went wrong? Clearly we were, when I was coming along with Lonnie Guinier and the rest, we thought we were part of the movement that was going to change America.
I did too. In fact, when I graduated from law school in 1957, I went up to see Judge William Hastie, the first black federal judge, a very sophisticated man. And I told him in my interest of being a civil rights lawyer, he said, "Derrick, praiseworthy, but you were born 15 years too late. The Brown decision has been decided. There's some mopping up to be done." What happens throughout history, though, David, is that during economic good times or during national crises, the recognition of the need for blacks to have basic rights increases. During economic bad times, it goes down. During the latter part of the 19th century, you could almost trace the economic conditions in various southern regions by the number of blacks reported lynched. Now, we don't have the lynching today of the same form, but as Americans generally become, understandably, anxious because of the loss of jobs, their unwillingness. Even Business Week had a cover story last week about the inaccuracy of government statistics. It's very easy, once again, for politicians to deflect the attention from their own failed policies to the traditional scapegoat, black people.
Now, given some of the reports that particularly the wages for people of middle and moderate means and working class people perhaps will not grow again in our lifetimes, what does that portend for the nature of race relations?
Well, I think
how do you fight this?
I think that we are looking at a repeat of a century ago when historians indicated that this was the Black Nadir during the 1890s, the first decade or so into the 20th century. And we seem to be repeating it for some of the same reasons. It's very easy to conclude that, well, conclusions were made in the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, that blacks have enough rights that the Constitution could provide. Now it's up to them to pick themselves up.
And here we go again.
On their own. Yes, I think we are.
In your book, Confronting Authority, Reflections of an Ardent Protester, you suggest, and I think an interesting statement, that racism not only hurts, obviously, blacks, Latinos, and others on the receiving end, but it can also hurt the majority.
Oh, yeah, that's the easiest thing to say. I mean, if I could get that message across, you could carry me away. I would think that my mission as a teacher were complete. But it is very tough. It's been very tough throughout history. How would you have gone about getting the white indentured servants, formerly indentured servants, now the yeomen, during the middle 1600s when slavery was just getting underway? How could you convince them that they were being sold a bill of goods by the plantation owners who said, hey, we're going to reduce these blacks to lifetime indentured slavery, and you got to stand with us in case they try to escape or revolt. And we're going to let you vote. We're going to lower the poll taxes. Well, once they agreed to that, they were always going to be economically subordinated. They couldn't afford slaves. They were never going to be able to compete. And we have that same pattern down through history. We have it again today, where the reaction to the wholesale shipment of jobs out of the country, the wholesale importation of legal and illegal aliens, the downsizing, the automation. The response to all of that is, well, it must be affirmative action. And people buy it.
I guess it's not accidental, and I've heard this discussed, that at this very time you suddenly hear sort of these bizarre quasi-scientific notions of black inferiority starting to come to the fore again.
Periodic. I was down in Athens, Georgia, last week, delivering the Hunter Holmes lecture honoring Charlene Hunter Gauld and Hamilton Holmes, who integrated the University of Georgia in 1961. I can't believe that much time has gone. I was a junior attorney working on that case back here in New York. But in any event, I was reminded that also in 1961, there was a Savannah school case that I was working on. And the school board hired all of these, in quotes, experts to come in and put on testimony, which the local judge allowed them to put on, proving that blacks were genetically inferior. Included in that material was IQ test results. And the argument was that Brown should be rejected because the court hadn't considered the fact that blacks were inherently inferior, as these tests showed. Well, the courts rejected it at the time, but there's been a periodic falling back to these kinds of tests. You know, it's the interesting comment I want to make about the Charles Murray book.
Right.
Is that since his bottom line is really, let's get rid of welfare, let's get rid of affirmative action, let's put blacks back clearly into the corner, that he could have made those same arguments even if he had manipulated the data the other way from the way he manipulated, and came out and said, well, blacks are 15 points higher than any white.
And therefore need nothing.
That's right. So he could have used the same argument. So it's not the IQ test.
Right.
It's what's behind. What is the force behind? And that is, it's just an anti-black theme.
It's interesting how people, we have no historical memory sometimes, and clearly there are other ethnic groups in the United States who have suffered similarly. For instance, I did my senior thesis at Yale Law School on Chinese exclusion, and much of that, the passage of legislation that prevented the Chinese from immigrating, was based upon scientific evidence. The scientific evidence at that time, at the turn of the century, however, was phrenology. And it showed, based upon the bumps on the heads of Chinese, by great experts, most of them at Yale, by the way, that they were prone to violence and sexual assaults. Well, and that was used as part of the justification for not clamping down on the number of Chinese coming into the United States.
Well, Jews face the same problem.
Absolutely. And the Irish.
IQ test and what have you. So it's nothing new.
Right.
I think it doesn't make it less dangerous.
Understood.
Given the media's willingness to pick it up, and the media is functioning based on what they think their audiences
wants to hear.
And they give it to them.
Right. I see Mr. Murray's book is #3 on the bestseller list now, and I think obviously that portends for quite a struggle. Let's talk about what we do now. Clearly, African Americans and other subjected groups have never laid down and let this happen easily. What do progressives, what do people who don't like this kind of America that's starting to build, which, as you say, won't only sweep down poor blacks and Latinos, but will hurt a lot of other people. What do people start to do to confront these issues?
I think that there are as in any catastrophe, there is opportunity. And I think that the results in the election last week, some of these other developments that we're talking about, serve as a wake-up call for an awful lot of people of color, as well as whites who are progressive but perhaps have been sitting down on the job or bemoaning the fate of where even the people they elect have gone. That this means a massive effort of self-help, beginning with the individual. In my book, I talk about what happens to the individual protester, the person that stands up when everybody else is sitting down, who speaks out when everyone else is silent. Well, basically, it's not good. Those in power retaliate.
Right.
Those who you would hope would align themselves with you back off and perhaps become hostile. Nevertheless, there are marvelous values in standing up. And rather than wait until new leaders come forth, until new organizations are formed, I think that the invitation out there now is that in whatever way we can, we as individuals need to reach out and do what we can to start moving things in the other direction. Well, you say, what can one person do? Well, it's amazing what one person can do once they're willing to do it. People say to me, well, Bell, you gave up your job at Harvard. Have they hired anybody up there? The answer is no. They said, well, then you lost. I said, no, I didn't lose. A whole generation of students, not only at Harvard, but at law schools across the country, know what I stood up for. And whether they're willing to do it right now or not, they know that that is an option that has been given to them not simply in lecture form or preachment form, but through example. And I think so I've already heard myriads of stories, letters and all, about people who decided, based on reading what I did, to confront their bosses or somebody else in authority who was abusing them.
Right. I think two things. I give, there is hope, and I see it also with young people I talk to. I see the same kind of sense of eagerness to take on challenges as I did in the generation we came along in. And I don't think they can be happy about the kinds of trends, which interestingly enough already starts to impinge upon other values that we were starting to move towards, particularly support of women and a more equitable workplace and a more humane society of that sort. It doesn't, this kind of shift doesn't stop and target, well, as soon as we finish with the problems of the African Americans, that we won't go to other parts of the social agenda that were tied up with that. And I think there's going to be a growing understanding that you just can't delimit, well, that, you know, the blacks are not doing so well, but women are still forging ahead in the society, and other protected classes are doing just fine. It's not going to work.
No, I think it rolls back. I think one of the happy points of a rather sad Tuesday was the support that Carl McCall got from large segments of the Jewish community in response to the really vicious campaign launched by his Republican competitor. And I think that we need much, much more of that. There's been too much focus on what Farrakhan said or didn't say, and too little recognition that blacks and Jews are really in the same boat. That is, we are both outsiders, and that the one group certainly has a lot more in the way this society measures success. But if the deal goes down, if blacks go down, I think there's still going to be a need for scapegoats. And the traditional scapegoats, I think, are Jews in this society.
It's also clearly an anti-urban move as well.
Yes.
That's also sweeping in, that the values of urban life in America are being brought up to question, that we seem to want to go back to a much simpler time when everyone thought it was women were in the home, the men went out to work, everyone came back to a suburban or rural home, and the values were all there. Of course, they don't talk about the bad stuff.
You can't go home again.
You can't go home.
The fact is that the urban society is a necessary part of modern society. That you talk about jobs, we're going to need to look for alternatives to jobs. We may be coming to an end of jobs, at least to the extent that we once measured any individual's success, their well-being, their status, even their self-esteem by what they did. Many of those jobs are now disappearing.
In that, Labor Secretary Reich obviously has written very extensively on the problem of who's going to be able to work in the new 21st century. And clearly the need of highly skilled workers is what it's going to be, just at a time when public education, particularly in the inner cities, is deteriorating incredibly. But it was interesting. I did get the chance to testify down in Washington before a congressional committee on equity in education, school financing. And my staunchest defenders turned out to not be the Democratic members of the committee, but two junior Republicans who were representing blue-collar communities in the Rust Belt, who said basically, we don't know about all this stuff about minority children, but our kids are getting lousy education, only a fraction of what's being spent on their education, of what's happening in neighboring communities, and they're staring out into space with no new jobs. And I think that's ultimately, hopefully not too long, is what's going to turn the nation. where we realize we're facing a common problem here of ill-educated young people who can't participate in the economy.
And even with the quality jobs that Wright talks about, he's not giving us the full story.
Right.
The fact is that one of these skilled jobs replaces 20 workers,
right.
maybe 30 workers, you see. And that there has to be something, some provision made for them, even for those at the top. Otherwise, those at the top are going to be brought down.
In support of that notion, my people come from Barbados, West Indies, and we learned shortly that that one of the big airlines started to do all their data entry work there and ship back the information by microwave.
Yeah.
Why? Because the wage rate was about a third of what it is for minimum wage worker here, but moreover, the literacy rate was one of the best in the world. And they didn't need to check the error rate with these workers. But I think all over the world, a number of economies are focusing on the skills of their entry-level workers in a way we haven't. In Singapore and parts of the West Indies and other areas where they're focusing on their wage primary education, much more so, not only than an inner-city child here in Brooklyn, but also in just an ordinary community. We're just not training them very well at this point.
You know, the short run is very profitable. The long run is
Let's talk specifically about the African American community and what it's going to do. We're sort of at a particular nadir in a lot of ways. We really have our traditional leadership, particularly from things like the NAACP, to a lesser extent the Urban League, have not been out front yet on these issues. There's been a major disruption, obviously, in the leadership of the NAACP, but it's a culmination of a long history of problems. How will those organizations react, in your view?
You know, I think that the NAACP, to mention one, is that what is happening at the top is really unfortunate. But as you say, it's been coming for a long time. And if we want to be perfectly honest, the NAACP is always in some little turmoil at the top.
Right.
It's always been the branches that have been the main support. It's to the local branch the individuals go with their complaints. It's the local branch that reaches out and speaks to public accommodations, personnel, and to employers and what have you. And I think to a great extent that's going to continue happening. I would hope that some of the suggestions that Roger Wilkins has made about putting the operation at the national level into receivership, having a blue ribbon group come in, it was a little conservative for me, but a blue ribbon group who would be able to come up with a new board, a very small workable board, make recommendations for new leadership. That can happen. But if it doesn't, I think local organizations will
start to
continue
emerge.
on. And the other part of it is that there are really a lot of local leaders and groups, don't get very much attention and what have you, but that are working away, doing Herculean tasks. And I think that these will probably get more support as both things get worse,
right.
And the traditional organizations fail to function.
One of the other interesting things that's emerging is clearly, can a coalition be maintained or forged between Hispanic Americans and African Americans facing many of the same problems in terms of poverty, lack of education, political powerlessness, but clearly seen as one of the fracture lines in terms of efforts? Very
difficult. I think as with the coalitions with whites, it's certainly worth trying. But again, the great sense of individuals coming into this country is that I want to move up, and the way to do that, or one of the ways, is to, as Toni Morrison said it, the second word you learn is nigger, and that you feel that you're superior to this other guy who may have been here for 300 years. And that was a very attractive way to go for Europeans,
right.
who were the same color as those who were already here.
Right. For
people coming with a different language, with a different color and parts, it's going to be even more attractive. So that while we may bemoan the failure with both Hispanics and Asians we can embrace and applaud the few gains along those lines have been made, because it really will be tough. I don't think the fact that America is going to be mainly minority by 2020 or whatever makes a bit of difference if so many of those who are people of color are busy trying like mad to identify with those who are white.
I guess that raises a question. One of the other outcomes of the recent election was a California piece of legislation which would severely restrict particularly the rights of undocumented aliens for basic protections.
No, again, it's the frustration. I mean, if you don't even have to know very much about Supreme Court decisions to see that that almost certainly is going to be declared unconstitutional in whole or in substantial part. And yet the sense of upset and rage that can be channeled to a relatively powerless group. And the same people who are doing the channeling were those who a few years ago were encouraging the importation of illegal aliens to do work at dirt cheap prices. So that this idea of waking up, what's the expression that until white people get smart, black people can't get free? Well, I don't want to wait that long, but there's still a lot of truth in that. And so that one of our main tasks is going to, while involving ourselves in self-help here, also doing whatever is possible to try to get whites to see today what they and their predecessors haven't been willing to see for 300 years.
Understood. What would Dr. King say about all this? How would he be positioning himself to try to help and bring some changes?
Well, one thing is clear. He would not be saying what President Clinton had him saying at the Baptist church. Why those guys didn't get up and politely, because he's president, ask him to leave, I do not know.
Maybe for our audience, you'll refresh there.
Well, you remember Clinton went to this Baptist convention and said, well, if King were here, he would be appalled that black people are killing other black people, and that's not what he fought for freedom for, and what have you. Yeah. It's, you know, it's the most scurrilous, hypocritical thing imaginable. I mean, if he were a dumb man, perhaps you'd let it pass as ignorance, but he is not dumb. Mm-hmm. The fact is that we forget that King, at his death, and probably death was caused by his recognition that racial equality was going to be impossible without economic equality. And he would be even more convinced of that today, because the gap in the wealth, the gap in income between those at the top and the rest is as bad as it's been at any time in this century. And the gap continues to grow. Right. And if those who were elected last Tuesday have their way, it will grow even larger. Mm-hmm. So that I think that he would be greatly concerned because of the lost ground in terms of economic opportunity that have occurred in the last 20 years.
I guess when I look to my 14-year-old, I'm trying to present to him and my daughter, 9, what they should be preparing themselves for. In your view, as you're dealing with students every day, how should we start to get them tough enough and ready enough to confront these kinds of challenges? That really, we weren't setting it up this way. And I think I speak for many professional and middle-class black Americans who were interested in this issue and fighting this issue. We thought our children were going to have all options and didn't have to worry about these struggles. Clearly, that's not going to be the case. How should we start tooling them up to handle this?
It's very hard, but I think that the answer is in most religious teaching, that life is challenge, and that here is this array of challenges we didn't think you were going to have to face, but there they are. Right. You may get over them, you may not. But your success depends on not the fortuity of success or failure as the society measures it, but the degree to which you commit yourself to doing it, to making it better, to reaching out where you see injustice, where you see wrong, getting trained for that purpose, changing jobs for that purpose. The remarkable thing about it, and I think it's my experience, I think it's Lonnie Guinier's experience, is that if that is your aim, to make it better regardless of the risk, regardless of the criticism and the rejection, somehow, in many instances, you end up even doing better on the bottom line of your career than if you had played it safe, taken stuff that you really shouldn't have taken, accepted injustice that you shouldn't have accepted and all. So that the message, and it's hard, I have 3 grown sons, the message is to reach out try to make things better in your job. Try to do it with as much integrity as well as much energy as possible. And the rewards are, some of the rewards are guaranteed. The reward of feeling better about yourself is guaranteed. The reward of bottom line success is less guaranteed, but it occurs often in ways that we would never expect.
I've heard reported that you actually told Lonnie Guinier not to take the Harvard position.
Oh yes. No,
I mean, it was actually following through on exactly what you've said.
Yeah, I thought that they having really done a serious disservice to two of her black women counterparts, that if they wanted her there, they should not ask her for a visit in which she would have to be subjected to a year of scrutiny, a person of her achievements. That they should do for her what they've done for these white males and offer a permanent appointment that she can either accept or turn down.
Just to confirm your belief, I did a little sort of historical retrospective of people I came up with through school. And the ones who, in many cases, who stayed closest to the corporate model often were destroyed. Some of them real profoundly sad stories. And I do think there's an upside in struggle, which is not only one where you're doing the right God's work here or doing moral things, but that basically it's tapping into the needs of people who will buoy you up. And I think perhaps it's been lost in this period.
Well, that's we can start with our children and try to reach. I try to reach out to my students. Who listen a lot more than my children too.
It's interesting, though, that some of the latest proposals coming out of now a conservative Congress are going to frighten a lot more than working and poor blacks.
No, I think so.
The notion that has been propounded and floating out there of setting up national orphanages or mega orphanages to handle minority children, all sorts of ideas that hark back not even to this century, that actually hark to other more terrible times, I think will bring new adherence to this struggle.
No, I think that's right.
So,
I think even Oliver North didn't make it,
right.
which is a blessing. Ted Kennedy did make it, so that all is not lost. The area of struggle is great, but the few victories indicate that it's worth pursuing.
Thank you, Professor Bell. It's been very instructive.
Thank you very much.
Today, some 40 years after the birth of the Civil Rights Movement, we're still struggling with race issues in America. Clearly, we still do not provide equal education and opportunity for all our children. Too often, these issues founder on the rocks of racism. This nation needs to strengthen and contribute and seek the contributions of all of its citizens to face a highly competitive world. To write off even the least of its people diminishes all of us. This is David R. Jones. Thank you for joining me on the Urban Agenda.
To comment on the Urban Agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York, 10010. Area code 212-254-8900.